Sure, sure. For no space, right? Okay. Right. Hey, how are you? Have some people sitting here?
I'm okay. I've spent the last 2 days in New York, one of them on the South Asian Fund. But did not give a good talk, along with this part. Well, let's see.
Well, this is not 5 minutes. And really full. It doesn't take much to fill it. Really full.
I saw a picture.
That's a great idea. This, I think, has been renamed, though, the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum.
Oh, really?
I think so. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Yeah. I have an idea that it has, anyway. The Teco people are okay. I recognize them. They've sent their megawatt.
Carefully, your microphone is probably.
It is. It is.
Yeah, I can hear you.
They sent their megawatt and the tech.
Oops.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is William Kirby, and on behalf of the Harvard Chinese Student Association, the Harvard Asia Center, the Harvard Fairbanks Center, and the Institute of Politics, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to tonight's forum, which is on China-Taiwan, the cross-strait relationship. Before I begin, I'd like to recognize the two individuals who have really made this forum happen, sitting right in front of me, John Yasuda and Nina Ni. Without you, we wouldn't be here, so 非常感谢. This is a topic of seemingly permanent interest because the relationship between China and Taiwan, between the People's Republic of China and Taiwan, has not been resolved in any fundamental way since the end of the Chinese Civil War in a military sense in 1949. So it's been with us for more than a half of a century. This relationship was in some sense the last site of the Civil War as a battlefield, and the first site across the strait of emergingly different Chinas in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, when Taiwan became a model of ultimately what China might aspire to be in its economic miracle, and in the 1980s and 1990s when Taiwan became an arena of political experimentation yet to be emulated by its neighbor across the strait. Arguably, the success of the Republic of China on Taiwan is the greatest success story in all of its dimensions in the realm of Greater China since 1949, and yet it is still the main source of tension in the Chinese-speaking world, and arguably one of the greater sources of tension in East Asia. Surely it is one of the few sources of potential war in East Asia today. We are speaking here today in an era, or at least in a moment of, but in the last year, of relative quiescence in cross-strait relationships, at least in terms of the kind that regularly get into the news, in terms of military, strategic, or political conflict. A relatively calm time in Chinese-American relations over the issue of Taiwan, and a relatively calm time in cross-strait political rhetoric. And therefore, perhaps a good time to step back and think more broadly and more quietly about the complex issues that affect the relations of Chinese and Taiwan, of Chinese on either side of the strait, or if you prefer other ethnic terms for the peoples on either side of the strait. We're in an era of incredibly rapid economic integration across the strait, a time when whole parts of the city of Shanghai seem to be turning into small and not so small Taibeis, a period of incredibly rapid social integration across the Taiwan Strait, where individuals from either side of the strait are getting married, sometimes more than once. But we're not in an era of political integration, and in fact, in an era of still very cold political relations. To begin our conversation on the multiple dimensions of the cross-strait relations, I'd like to first turn to Professor Dwight Perkins, the director of Harvard's Asia Center, who has been at Harvard since 1963, when relations between Taiwan and the People's Republic were simply non-existent, and we wouldn't have had quite the same kind of panel as we're having today. Professor Perkins has served as Associate Director of what was then the East Asian and now Fairbank Research Center, Chairman of the Department of Economics, and Director of the Harvard Institute for International Development. He served as advisor or consultant on economic policy and reform to the governments of Korea, China, Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea, and not Taiwan, which probably didn't need your advice. And
I think that's a safe statement, yes.
And has served as a long-term consultant to the World Bank and the Ford Foundation. It's a pleasure to first turn matters over to Professor Perkins.
Okay. My understanding is that we have a very brief time, and so one needs to make some very simple, straight statements that will come across as more blunt and less subtle than they should. The first point, when I think about the future of, and I'm mostly concerned here about the future of mainland Taiwan relations, and I start from the proposition that independence is completely unrealistic. And it's unrealistic because, in my view, it will very likely, or at least the probability of war resulting is sufficiently high to make it not a viable option. We all have our stories, many of you do as well, about how one reaches that conclusion. I've sat in meetings with mainland Chinese generals where, not bragging at all in the context that we were talking about, they say if this happens, we will have to go to war. They're not bragging because in this particular conversation, I remember vividly, the individual general basically said, we know we're going to take a shellacking when we go into war, because it'll be war with the United States, but we're going to have to do it anyway. So if you sort of eliminate independence as a viable option, then one has to talk about what is it that could possibly either bring these countries over time to, or these economies over time together. And I'm an economist, so I focus on the economic situation. And the first point I think to make about the economic situation is, of course, one of the barriers to getting together on any viable way, in addition to the obvious political ones, is that the per capita income of Taiwan is around $20,000 in exchange rate terms. No, $13,000 exchange rate. The mainland is $1,000. In purchasing power parity, Taiwan is, I don't know exactly what, because I haven't seen, but say 20,000, and the mainland 2,500. This is a huge gap in per capita income. And obviously the whole standard of living makes the notion of sort of these two societies, in some sense, living in the same country, however it was organized, seem quite unrealistic. That said, that figure is itself somewhat misleading, because Shanghai has probably half the per capita income of Taiwan, and and so there are parts of China where the differences are not so great, and of course large numbers of Taiwanese businessmen, as Bill is saying, are living in Shanghai and in the mainland. So that the differences are very real, and they are a barrier to any kind of settlement. But they're also one of the forces that is driving the change that is occurring. As when you have a enormous disparity in per capita income of the kind you have between the Chinese mainland and Taiwan, that is itself driving the businessmen on Taiwan to the mainland. Like their counterparts elsewhere in the world, the manufacturing operations of Taiwan have largely gone, have gone or are in the process of going to the Chinese mainland. It began with shoes, and it's going on in textiles, and going on with computers now, and so on. Huang Yaosheng will talk more about this in detail, so I'm not going to dwell on it here. So there is this drive to move outside of Taiwan, to move much of the areas where low labor costs are critical to the Chinese mainland, and also to Southeast Asia. But Southeast Asia is quite a long way away. Now, when you think about, well, okay, these investors are doing that, but what's the problem? Taiwan has had an enormously successful economic run now for ever since really 1960. And it's largely had that successful economic run without really any involvement of the mainland. This involvement of the mainland is a fairly recent phenomenon, but mostly in the last decade. And Taiwan has, in that process, gone from being a labor-intensive manufacturer of shoes to being extremely well-placed for high-tech manufacturing and services in a wide variety of areas. It's actually done significantly better in that regard, in my opinion, than, say, South Korea, and of course much better than most other economies around the world. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is the following. The manufacturing, in fact, the modern economies of today are increasingly, as you all know, globalized. So that one manufactures a part here and another part somewhere else, and one has the design somewhere else and the marketing in addition place. Most of the manufacturing establishments, whether we're talking about, or the industrial establishments, whether we're talking about the United States or whether we're talking about Japan or Korea or Hong Kong or whatever it happens to be, have had to become globalized. Now, in one sense, Taiwan is extraordinarily well placed to be globalized. It already has ties around the world. It, of course, because of language and cultural similarities, it is naturally placed to take advantage of the mainland economy. And many of the Chinese businesses of Hong Kong are, in fact, leaders in this effort at globalization. One thinks of the firm of Li and Feng and so on. But then you turn to the reality of the nature of the contacts between Taiwan and the mainland. And you go to Chiang Kai-shek Airport, and of course there are no flights anywhere to the mainland. You go to Hong Kong, you can fly anywhere in the Chinese mainland. You go to Incheon, I was in Incheon just a few weeks ago, and you not only can fly to Qingdao and Beijing and to the northeast, you can fly all over the interior of China. Taiwan, and many in Taiwan have pushed this issue in the past, but Taiwan is very well placed to be a hub for all of China, Asia, but particularly for the mainland of China. But it has to be, but it will have to make fundamental changes if it is going to do that. And the issue is, of course, are there any risks in this? And the answer, of course, there are risks. Will the mainland use this to pressure Taiwan? Almost certainly. Does Taiwan have a choice? My own view is no. It has to move in this direction. The alternatives are all worse. And if we want to get into why, we can go into the question period. So.
Thank you, Dwight. And just looking at the press last evening, there is, as you may know, this plan for indirect, directly indirect or indirectly direct flights that would go from Taipei. You could charter them for Chinese New Year's, which don't seem to be likely to happen, but that's...
Well, and you know, it isn't the same thing.
Yes.
I mean, I used to go often from Beijing to Korea, South Korea, and it would take all day. You'd fly, I mean, you'd fly down, because you couldn't go over North Korean space, you'd fly down over Shanghai and then up to Tokyo, and then you take a plane from Tokyo to Seoul. It literally was an all-day affair, and now it's an hour and a quarter, or hour and a half, or whatever it is. You know, anyway.
Anyway, let us turn now to Professor Yasheng Huang, who received his bachelor and doctorate in government here at Harvard. And he's a professor of business, government, and international economy at the Harvard Business School. He's also a faculty associate of the Center for International Affairs, Fairbanks Center, and the Asia Center here at Harvard. And his work looks at the institutional and policy drivers of foreign direct investment in China, including investment from Taiwan. He's published widely, including 2 books, Inflation and Investment Controls in China, and a new book, a terrific book, which should be required reading and will be required reading for the next time I teach my core course on Greater China. It's called Foreign Direct Investment in China. Professor Huang.
With that endorsement, I'm expecting some constant stream of royalty payment, which I have not.
Chinese intellectual property rights. Yeah.
Which I have not earned in the past, in my past publications. Yeah. Let me talk about China and Taiwan relations, cross-strait relations from 3 perspectives. One is the economic aspect, and just to sort of put some numbers, the trade in 2001 between China and Taiwan was about $27 billion, and that was about 11% of trade, total trade in China, of China. FDI, foreign direct investment, was about $3 billion. That was about 7% of the total FDI inflows into China in 2001. So despite the view that the economic interactions between the 2 sides of Taiwan Strait have increased in importance, in fact, if you look at FDI, the relative share of FDI by Taiwan has actually declined. In 1990s, it was about 9% at one point. And now, because China is a very attractive FDI destination, so it is increasingly attracting large Western, Japanese, US multinational corporations. So the relative importance of Taiwan is actually declining. So without the kind of direct transport, without the kind of political supporting environment for further economic integration, I, for one, worry about the economic relationship between China and Taiwan, and especially at a time when China is gaining a lot of attention from many companies in the world. If the Taiwanese government is not more proactive in fostering that economic ties, Taiwan may lose its economic competitiveness in China. The second aspect has to do with, it's not so much the economic importance per se, but the way that Taiwanese economy is organized, which I believe that Dwight has done a lot of work on this, which I believe has a very positive impact on Chinese way of thinking about how to develop the economy. The Taiwanese economy developed on the basis of small and medium enterprises. It developed on the basis of a relatively efficient financial market. It developed on the basis of supporting indigenous firms. It's a market economy. And these are the kind of aspects of the economic model that are attractive to the Chinese when the Chinese are moving forward to a market economy. The former Party Secretary of China in 1980s, Hu Yaobang used to refer to Taiwan as our model province. He was thinking about, actually, he was thinking mostly in political terms, which is something I'm going to get to next. So Taiwan is an economic model for China. I also believe that it should be a political model for China as well. The island made a peaceful transition from an authoritarian system to a democratic system, and this is something that I think should be one of the proudest achievements of the Taiwanese society and Taiwanese people. And that transition debunks the idea that Chinese culture is incompatible with democracy, although I understand some people on Taiwan don't believe they're Chinese, but then still the idea is that the culture that is similar to the Chinese culture that's coming from a long Confucian tradition is still in the end compatible with a democratic system, and that's to me a encouraging sign. Let me just comment very briefly before I end on the role of Taiwan in the modernization of China. I believe that role ought to be very, very important. It could be more important than it is now. If the government on Taiwan, I believe, if the government on Taiwan doesn't pursue the independence agenda as aggressively as it has done, I believe that agenda is hugely unproductive and damaging not only to Taiwan itself, but also to a future of China that most people in this room would cherish to see. Greater interactions, economic interactions, social interactions between Taiwan and China are going to help China move forward to a market economy. It's going to be extremely helpful for China to develop a middle class, which is going to moderate the nationalistic sentiment in China. And so when there's sufficient political progress in China, then we can think about how to deal with the independence issue. So rather than putting independence issue ahead of some sort of political and economic convergence between China and Taiwan, we ought to postpone, and Taiwanese leaders ought to postpone that agenda to a future time when China politically is a little bit different from it is now. And it has all the promise of becoming a more humane, modern, and a more democratic system and society. So we ought to give the Chinese leadership time and the necessary environment to work out lots of the problems and lots of issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Yashua. The cross-strait relationship is a complicated one, not the least because of politics, different political systems, different political ideologies, and different political eras since 1949, 1950, and not the least in recent times because Taiwan has been such a moving target, as it were, so changing so rapidly in political terms. The PRC has changed, of course, in political terms as well, but less obviously in some ways to external observers. Taiwan has moved from being a military dictatorship to what one might think of as a technocratic autocracy, to now a vibrant and raucous electoral democracy with all of the unpredictability that that term entails. This is a weekend of elections in Taiwan, and perhaps the only thing that we can predict with absolute certainty was predicted in today's Crimson, which I'm sure you've all read, is that whoever wins the mayoral election, a very good article by Johnny Tsui, whoever wins the mayoral election in Taipei will be a Harvard alum, which is surely assures good governance. To enlighten us on the political relationship across the strait, we turn to Professor Stephen Goldstein, who's the co-director of the Fairbanks Center Taiwan Studies Workshop here at Harvard, and he's the Sophia Smith Professor of Government at Smith College. He serves on the editorial board of the China Quarterly and the Journal of Contemporary China. He has written very widely about China's relations with the Soviet Union, with the United States, and in particular in recent years, very presciently on Taiwan in all of its dimensions. He has hands-on experience in moments of great political change in China. During the 1989 Tiananmen demonstrations, he was a commentator with CNN and CBS, and is here nevertheless. He has written, co-authored, and edited 8 books and more than 20 articles, and it's a pleasure to turn it over to Steve.
Thanks, Bill. In terms of cross-strait political relations, I think there are 4 questions that you have to address, and I'll probably have time for 3, and we'll throw out the 4th for last. I think the first question is, how would you characterize the current state of cross-strait relations? And I think the way I would characterize it would be as an equilibrium resulting from stalemate. And what that means is that neither side today can achieve its maximal goals in terms of the other side. And it might be useful for a second to look at what those maximal goals are. I think for the mainland, for the People's Republic of China, they have 2 maximal goals. One is Taiwan's reunification, as they would put it, with the mainland under the principle of one country, 2 systems. And the second maximal goal is the termination of Taiwan's place in the international system as a quasi-state entity apart from the People's Republic of China. As far as Taiwan is concerned, it too has, I think if you put it simply and as Dwight said sort of bluntly, has 2 goals vis-a-vis the international system in the mainland. The first is equality. It wants to be treated in any negotiations and any interactions in the international system by the mainland as an equal. The second goal, it seems to me, of any Taiwan government, if you take out the 2 extremes, is to maintain its rights as a full sovereign member of the international community of states. Now, one observation, and one very obvious observation, that these are obviously irreconcilable goals. And because they're irreconcilable goals, it seems to me that you can deduce from that or conclude from that that the chances of compromise are less likely than the chances of conflict. That is because neither side finds the present situation acceptable. Both sides would like to change it if they could. So it's an unstable equilibrium. It's an equilibrium that both sides accept as a less than acceptable situation. The second question, it seems to me, is what are the causes? What are the causes of these irreconcilable goals? And obviously the causes are very complex, but again, to simplify, it seems to me that the major source of those causes lies in the history, but also in the domestic politics of both countries. And I think that's where the focus should always be on cross-strait relations, is what is the impact of this issue on the domestic politics. If you were to look at the mainland, it seems to me that 4 points are very important to keep in mind. The first point is that the recovery of Taiwan is for the mainland leadership a symbol, really. It's a symbol of the culmination of the Chinese Revolution. It's a symbol of the end of a century or more of domination by external powers who intervened in the internal affairs of China. At the elite level, and this is the second point that I'd make, no leader in China can be soft on the Taiwan issue. As I keep saying, it's probably as close to the anti-communism issue was during the McCarthy era. You would pay a serious price to look soft on the Taiwan issue, particularly if you're a new successor who is somewhat young. Thirdly, at the mass level, we don't know, of course. The Chinese will always tell you that the Chinese people feel this, the Chinese people are insulted by that. We don't know what the Chinese masses want or don't want. But we do know that in the eyes of the leadership and in the eyes of many of the intellectuals, that this is a very volatile issue, that a leadership that gave away anything on the Taiwan issue or yielded on the Taiwan issue would have its legitimacy and perhaps the legitimacy of the role of the Communist Party questioned. Fourthly, there's the dead hand of Deng Xiaoping, reaching out of the grave and leaving a formula of one country, two systems, which the current leadership is very wont to abandon, because after all, it was Deng's legacy. For Taiwan, I think there are two major points that you'd want to make. One, the government today, the DPP government, is a minority government. It's a government whose fundamental bases of support come from the independence sentiment on Taiwan. So the current government can't go too far without beginning to alienate its very solid and very necessary base. But secondly, I think I would argue, and perhaps this is something that we might argue, that any of the major oppositions parties in Taiwan, be it the PFP or the KMT, are going to be guided by a public opinion that, at the moment, overwhelmingly favors status quo, separation from the mainland, but secondly, also wants to see Taiwan's visibility or profile in the international environment raised, or at least kept at the level where it is now. So, observation. It's in the domestic political interests of neither side to make any fundamental changes in their irreconcilable position. The third question, the third point, and the final point that I'm going to raise, and then we can talk about the fourth, perhaps in the discussion. The third question is, what factors sustain the present situation, and what might undermine the present situation? And here I think that what sustains the present situation is basically that both sides are benefiting from it. Both sides are gaining something from the present stalemate situation. The mainland, of course, is gaining, firstly, an absence of conflict in a peaceful environment for its addressing of its major issue, which is the modernization of China. Secondly, it's also getting a good relationship with the United States, which is an essential part of the modernization. Thirdly, the international image of Beijing is, of course, improved by a non-hostile approach to Taiwan. And finally, and fourthly, it is encouraging this economic exchange that we've talked about, and in the mainland's view, creating a constituency on Taiwan that favors reunification. As far as the Taiwan side is concerned, the economic benefits of the mainland have been, for the last 3 or 4 years, a lifesaver for an economy that's had serious problems. Secondly, the government has to satisfy at least some of the business demands in terms of ease of cross-strait economic relations. Thirdly, by maintaining an economic relationship, and I think I would differ slightly with Dwight as to who has the leverage. I think it's interdependency rather than dependency. But thirdly, at least in the view of some Taiwan people, it does help maintain the peace by giving the Chinese an economic interest. Quick factoid. About the mainland's about 40 billion exports, $40 billion worth of exports in electronic goods, 60% of those are by Taiwan corporations. That's not something China wants to throw away very quickly by imposing sanctions. And fourthly, and finally, as far as Taiwan is concerned, the benefit is that it presents a conciliatory face to the world. Taiwan doesn't look like a troublemaker. It looks like a responsible state trying to do the best it can in a difficult situation. That, I think, is what's sustaining the present status quo. And let me just very briefly say what I think is could possibly undermine it. And I think here we have an irony, because the very same factors that are sustaining the present status quo can undermine the present status quo. That is, if you go down that list that I did, and I won't go through it again, as far as the China side is concerned, it's a double-edged sword. Each, for example, the more it presents a peaceful, non-hostile picture or posture towards Taiwan, the more the world becomes less sympathetic for its own goals towards Taiwan. And you could go down every one of those, I think, 4 points that I made and find a negative to the long-term interests of China in reunification. And as far as Taiwan is concerned, it's a similar situation. Increasing economic ties does raise the problem of sanction, does raise the problem which the Taiwanese are always talking about, which is the existence of a fifth column, as they term it now in the newspapers, that is promoting closer relations with the mainland. And if you went down those factors, you could see, as far as each side is concerned, a dark side. In other words, the achievement of a short-term goal of stability undermines the possibility of the long-term goals that each side has. So to finish, last observation on that point is very simply the point that I began with, that what the current equilibrium of stalemate, as I call it, is most likely to lead to is not any kind of compromise. It might stay in stalemate for the near term, but as each side assesses the gains and costs of their current policies, one side might decide, if certain things happen, that the costs are greater than the gains. And that would be my fourth point: under what circumstances would they make those calculations? But that we can save for later.
Thank you, Steve, very much. One of the reasons why we're here, and so many people are here in this great American school in the United States of government, is that the issue of cross-strait relations is of very fundamental concern to the United States government and, by extension, to the people of the United States. This is no accident. This is because the United States has been, as it were, present from the creation, at least, of the separate Taiwan, with the introduction of the 7th Fleet in 1950, providing a military buffer between the mainland and Taiwan, and providing the military umbrella, ultimately, under which Taiwan would develop separately from the PRC politically and, at least initially, economically. For a very long period, from 1958 to 1996, the United States did not need to demonstrate militarily its concerns regarding the strait, and yet in 1996 the American government did so again. Cross-strait relations remain surely have the greatest potential for the destabilization of Chinese-American relations, whatever their effect on the parties on either side of the strait. And to help us think about that, we're extraordinarily fortunate to have our guest from as far away as we have a guest, Alan Romberg, who's the Senior Associate and Director of the Chinese Program at the Henry L. Simpson Center. Before that, he was Special Assistant to the Secretary of the Navy. He served in the Department of State from 1994 to 1999 as Principal Deputy Director of the Policy Planning Staff, and then until 1998 as Senior Advisor and Director of the Washington Office of the U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations. For 10 years, he also served as the C.V. Starr Senior Fellow for Asian Studies at the Council for Foreign Relations. He served in all 20 years as Foreign Service Officer dealing with East Asia, and also as Director of the State Department Office of Japanese Affairs and staff member of the National Security Council. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to Harvard.
Thank you very much. In many ways, the principal issue for the United States for a very long time, I'd go back even a little further than Dean Kirby did, has been sovereignty of Taiwan, who has it and how it's going to be determined. And the principal goals around that issue have changed, however, over time. In the mid-40s, from the time of the Cairo Conference and the Potsdam Conference, the issue was to return Taiwan to China, but the U.S. position, in fact, was that it never was legally returned to China. In the late 40s, the objective was to keep Taiwan out of communist hands, although not through military means. But also, it was strongly concerned with the brutality of the nationalist regime as it was shifting over to Taiwan. And so other options were considered, options that included trusteeship under the United Nations, or even a plebiscite, which it was expected probably would lead to independence. With the communist victory in 1949, however, the US government, also estimating that the communists would be able to take over Taiwan within a year, basically threw up its hands. And in January 1950, made a statement which was very famous about how the US was in fact not going to get involved, even though its view about Taiwan's legal status had not changed. As Secretary of State Acheson put it, we were not going to quibble with any lawyer's words. We were just going essentially to let nature take its course. This lasted for all of 5.5 months until the Korean War broke out, when President Truman interposed the 7th Fleet, by the way, both to stop the communists from going toward Taiwan, but also the nationalists from attacking the mainland, and said that the status of Taiwan was undetermined and could only be determined by one of 3 international events: peace in the Pacific, a treaty with Japan, or some UN action. None of that essentially ever was viewed to have happened in a way which changed the situation. So between 1950 and 1971-72, with the Nixon/Kissinger opening, the position remained that the status of Taiwan was undetermined. From that opening in the early 70s on, essentially what the US has done with its policy is to leave that question alone. The position is it's up to the Chinese themselves, and it has evolved into what has been called the One China policy. Well, what is the One China policy? The United States acknowledges the Chinese position that there is one China and Taiwan is part of it. It acknowledges it. It also doesn't support a one China, one Taiwan, or two Chinas, or independent Taiwan solution. But it also is worth noting, neither does it support reunification. That's their issue, as it's put. It's for the two sides of the strait to work it out. The US position essentially is what we are concerned about, or what we have been concerned about, except for that brief period in 1950, for all of these years has been that any resolution be peaceful. Why? Well, for one reason, it's tied to US domestic politics. Those politics have changed over time, but I think it has been essentially unacceptable in most of this period to the American public to simply allow a forceful resolution. And second, it is part of this is that it is a strategic national interest of the United States not to allow a forceful settlement of the Taiwan question. If we allowed that, what would that say for the rest of our, just putting it in today's context, for the rest of our commitments in the region, even though we may have treaty relationships with some or other kinds of relationships with others, nonetheless, the same point applies. Third, there is also, of course, concern for the well-being of the people in Taiwan. That was seen in the 40s. I mentioned the fact that the concern with the nationalist regime drove consideration of various alternative kinds of policies. And it has been especially true again since the democratization of Taiwan, starting in the late 80s. It's interesting that we know from all of the various documents that are now available that privately, I'm willing to say all, but maybe it's virtually all, presidents, secretaries of state, and national security advisors have privately said that they endorse one China, or the one China principle, or they can see the settlement of Taiwan in accordance with the one China principle, something like that. Even Ronald Reagan said that. But publicly, this has proven very difficult to do. Partially, that's for legal reasons. People have seen that if one did take a position of formally endorsing one China, and of course recognizing the government of the PRC as the sole legal government of that China, then it becomes very difficult to think of a legal international basis for arms sales or other security relationships, possibly even military intervention. Politically, it simply is unacceptable to impose a solution on Taiwan, for the Americans to do that. The upshot has been a position which is full of nuance, and I would also have to argue full of confusion, especially with the democratization and the Taiwanization of Taiwan politics, which also, one needs to note, came at the same time as essentially as Tiananmen and the end of the Cold War, and those are not irrelevant. It has become much harder to manage and integrate Taiwan policy with overall American China policy. 1995, Li Denghui's Cornell visit, 1999, his two-states theory, and 2000 with the election of Chen Shui-bian, coming from a party with a history of independence advocacy, brought moments of tension. But also, I would argue, they brought some clarification to U.S. policy. The result has been a much better defined statement of policy. That is, we have reemphasized the importance of peaceful resolution, but we have also said there should be no provocation from either side. There should be no unilateral efforts to change the status quo. That isn't to say the end result should be unification or independence, but that neither side should try to force one result or the other on its own. I think it's important to note that as much as a lot of us were concerned, have been concerned with President Bush's approach, which seemed to push the envelope on Taiwan policy, he endorsed this no provocation approach and the benefits of our one China policy in the campaign, in Beijing in February of 2002, and again, I would argue after August 3rd, when President Chen Shui-bian in Taipei talked about one country on each side, 一边一国. Let me conclude by noting where I see the debate on U.S. policy today. I think it really is being conducted at two levels. One is what you might call the macro level. One argument is that we should push Taiwan toward negotiation with the mainland, probably under Jiang Zemin's 1995 8 points, which would accord Taiwan full autonomy. It would have to be negotiated, but that's the basic thrust. The other side is, let's recognize reality. There are two states here. Let's drop the one China policy and get over it. The concern of the former group is largely that we could end up in war. The concern of the latter group is largely that we should act in accordance with reality and morality. U.S. policy, as I have described it, tries to walk a line that embraces both of those objectives, preventing war and acting properly, and we can assess in the question and answer period whether, in fact, U.S. policy has succeeded in doing that. At the micro level, and that's where the debate really operates today, the question is, how do we conduct relations with Taiwan? The principal issues are, one, how do we best address U.S. concern for Taiwan's security within a framework of overall China policy? This involves arms sales and other military relationships. It involves the question of so-called strategic ambiguity or strategic clarity, that is, under what circumstances would the U.S. Either get involved or stay out of involvement in a Taiwan contingency. And it also involves the political issue of how far to go with respecting Taiwan's dignity and its achievements. That involves such things as contacts policy between government officials, senior officials' visits or transits, Taiwan's international participation, and what I might call nameplates. What kinds of names are used for identifying Taiwan offices and so on. Let me just leave it at that, Bill.
Thank you, Alan, very much. Well, as you've heard, four extremely knowledgeable individuals, not one of which has been able to actually resolve the relationship between the People's Republic and Taiwan. So we ask for your help and for your questions. And as you do so, if you would identify yourself and come to a microphone and say to whom you are directing your question, please. And I ask that questions be questions, ideally, and not statements. Yes, sir. I'm sorry.
My name is Orijit Sengupta. I'm in the business school. I had a question. All of you seem to think this is a long-term problem. Now, should the U.S. try to create some kind of a NATO-like alliance between Japan, South Korea, India, perhaps, the other ASEAN states, to create some kind of a counterbalance to China so that it doesn't have to keep worrying about this? Like, does the U.S. really want to have this on its plate for the next 100 years, perhaps?
Well, we're already 50 into it, yes. I think we've already done that, but let me ask
wanna start?
Yeah, I think this is for you, actually.
That's Alan.
I guess my quick answer to your question is no, we shouldn't do that, and I don't think the nations of the region want to do that. It's very different from what the basis of NATO is. I don't see how it is in the United States' interest to create a situation which, as you describe it, I think, would put us into confrontation with China. I don't think we need to be in confrontation with China. This issue could put us at war. There's no question about that. I agree with that. But I don't think the way you handle that is by creating an adversary situation of this sort. So I would argue that no, we should not do that. I would also say that very quickly that I think our alliance relationships with Japan and South Korea in particular are very critical to our ability to help maintain peace and stability in the region through our presence. And it includes not just our military presence, but that is a very important component of it. But I don't think trying to forge an alliance of that sort is the way to go.
Just very quickly, since 54, 55, Taiwan has been wanting to become part of a multilateral Asia-Pacific alliance, and Dulles turned it down, and because it would be extremely provocative to the mainland, I think it remains that.
Yes, please.
Okay, my name is Harry Wang from Kennedy School. First, thank you, panel, for coming here to share with us with your perspectives. Questions for panel. As time goes on, say 20, 25 years after, it's because the great majority of people in Taiwan will be born in Taiwan, will actually have less likely have relatives who's born in mainland China, and will have less recognition that they are Chinese. I think they pretty much think they are Taiwanese. Do you think this will have major implications to the China-Taiwan relationships? Because I think the China leader have the big question to ask themselves, can China wait? Next.
Very good question. Steve?
Well, I think your point's a good one. And if you look at public opinion polls, and there's a lot of identity polling that goes on in Taiwan, it's no question that what seems to be growing is a Taiwan identity, not necessarily an ethnic identity, but what you'd call a civic identity, a sense of attachment to the political institutions of Taiwan and the history of Taiwan. And time in that respect is clearly running against the mainland.
Dwayne?
A brief word. The issue is time. What one's trying to do is buy maybe 50 years of staying out of war so that these things can hopefully resolve. And what you've implied in your remarks is, in fact, they're going to get further apart. But I would just suggest that while that's one force at work, potentially a much bigger force would be the fact that the people of Taiwan, while they might be separate, are all going to be heavily involved in the mainland in very direct ways, and mainland people will be increasingly involved in Taiwan in an economic business sense, and that will more than offset this separateness based on birth, which to a large degree is true even today.
Bill, may I add something to that?
Yeah, I would. Please.
When I first went to Taiwan, which was in 1960, to live there, my sense was that the feeling of Taiwanese identity, although it was sort of under wraps because of the political situation within Taiwan at the time, was to the exclusion of accepting Chinese identity for an awful lot of people. What I think has happened over time is that although Taiwanese identity has grown and certainly become much more public, I think a willingness to accept some level of Chinese identity has also grown. And what gives me hope for the future, so that we don't end up in a war to resolve this issue, is that if people on both sides, or let's say all sides, including the U.S., are creative enough, that all of this can be melded into a solution which does in fact meet the bottom line needs of all sides. And I think that this dual sense of identity, not one replacing the other, is a factor that could work to make that happen. But it certainly requires a lot of work on all sides.
Yashai, would you like to?
Yeah, I think the Taiwanese identity is stronger not just because more and more people are born on Taiwan, but because of a antagonistic relationship between China and Taiwan, which also increases Taiwanese identity. You usually define yourself not just who you are, but as someone against somebody else, right? So if the relationship between China and Taiwan improves, despite the fact more and more people are going to be born in Taiwan, I don't think the identity is going to be a severe threat to the relationship, to a smooth economic and political relationship cross straits.
Let me just add, I think those last two comments are very important. As a historian, Taiwan, clearly speaking as a historian, Taiwan individuals living on that island, which is really a frontier community over the last several centuries, have proved capable of having multiple identities, very often in eras before this was illegal, multiple passports, and a very significant presence of Taiwanese businessmen in mainland China during the period of Japanese rule was as Japanese citizens and Japanese passport holders on the Chinese mainland. I think I would very strongly associate myself with the last two comments. Yes, please.
I want to ask the people in the balcony first.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've been blinded. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Herman Liu. I'm from China. I'm the first-year student here in Kennedy School. I have a question for the panel. As in this century, as China is getting stronger and stronger in the global economy and the international affairs, how should U.S. reshape the China and Taiwan policy in order to play a more active role in helping both sides to solve this problem? And given the fact that the U.S. have played a more active role in the Middle East crisis, and in the same time, how should U.S. aim to maintain a healthier relationship with China, during this process? Thank you.
You know, when you think if America's success in the Middle East is any gauge for what we can hope, this is a very, very sobering question. Alan, would you care to comment, please?
Yeah, I think that, for one thing, I guess I would go back to an image that Secretary of State George Shultz used to use, which was to try and create an environment which facilitated positive cross-strait relationship. There is a great risk, there's a temptation to get into the middle of it and sort of either mediate or try and say you should do this and you should do that and so on. I don't think that's a winning approach, frankly. Number one, we will simply get blamed by probably both sides for what we do, and I don't think it's likely to be very helpful. I think that obviously both want us to do something. We have a long history in the post-World War II period of being manipulated by both sides and trying to get us to do things. But I think it is important, in my own view, and maybe I've been too involved in this policy over too long a period of time, to maintain essentially the policy that I described to you, and not to be tempted by either of the two macro arguments that I cited. The one is to push Taiwan to negotiate some sort of settlement with the mainland, and on the other hand, not to give in to the notion that, gee, these courageous folks in Taiwan deserve all of our backing, and whatever the PRC says, that's too bad. And of course, that would in any case run against your point about maintaining what I think is vital, which is healthy relationships with the PRC. So I think we need to try and stay out of their issue, but to make it clear that we do have an interest. It is, as I said before, a national strategic interest not to allow this issue to be resolved by force, and to keep healthy relationships with both sides. I don't have a much more creative approach to it than that.
Saying the same, I think really the same thing in a somewhat different way. The main role of the U.S. is to provide a military component that makes it difficult to solve the problem by military means, at least in the short run. But the changes are not going to come from some negotiating position of the United States. They're going to come from changes in the mainland, Chinese mainland. If they occur, and I mean fundamental changes in the way that the mainland is governed, as well as, of course, the continued growth of the economy. And it's those kinds of changes that are essential. And if they occur, when they occur, then I think the issue of negotiation between the two becomes much simpler. And the U.S. really has no real role in the political changes in the mainland.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Quack, and I'm from GSAS. I have a question about how American domestic politics play out in the Taiwan Straits. Looking through what has happened over the years, I kind of have an observation that presidents tend to veer towards Beijing while Congress tends to veer towards Taiwan. I mean, like we see Carter abolishing the Mutual Defense Treaty, and Congress reacts with the Taiwan Relations Act. The Clinton administration promises China that they're not going to give Li Denghui a visa, and Congress insists that it does. And after that, I think in 1996, Congress tries to pass a bill that have the TRA supersede the Reagan Joint Communique. So, I mean, like, I might be totally misled in my observation. If that is true, please correct me. But if there is something to what I see, could you explain how certain forces work on Congress and not on presidents, and how certain forces work on presidents and not Congress?
That's
Political.
I think I'd say two things in reply to that. One is, I think since the 1950s, Congress has almost had an institutional interest in Taiwan. One of the interesting things about some of the debate that accompanied the TRA and after was that, and also came out during the Clinton administration, was that Congress, when it was pressuring the Clinton administration by using the TRA, said very specifically that Congress has a special obligation, now codified in law, to monitor the president on this one foreign policy issue, special on this one. Because it is the only domestic legislation in this country where Congress has mandated a role in foreign policy to this extent. Second point that I'd make is that, again, poaching a little on Bill's status as a historian, if you go back even to the 50s, to the talks that we had with the Chinese, the secret talks, what you'd see is a pattern whereby the United States, that is, whoever was negotiating for the United States, any gesture of conciliation towards the People's Republic of China had to be matched with a similar gesture of friendship towards Taiwan, which in turn vitiated most of the effectiveness of the gesture towards the People's Republic of China. So it's been a real conundrum determined by domestic politics as to how far any government can go because of that duality.
I just add two comments on this. It's a very interesting question. You ought to write a thesis on this question. First of all, I want to reiterate something I said before, and that is you have to keep in mind that the opening up of Taiwan, which made Taiwan very attractive in American politics, occurred at the same time virtually as Tiananmen. So you have bad PRC image, good Taiwan image, which has had a major effect, especially in an institution like Congress. And because the Cold War was over and it was harder to say, well, but we need to maintain this relationship with the PRC for strategic reasons, although I happen to think one could make that argument, but it was much harder to be persuasive. That also, I think, gave those in the Congress who wanted to stand up and sort of talk about this issue more space. The other thing I'd point out is this is not only a congressional administration issue. Remember when John F. Kennedy took over as president, on the eve of his inauguration, he met with Eisenhower. And Eisenhower said to him, you know, I want to stay out of your way. But the one issue, if you make a wrong move on it, and it's reported differently whether it's in the UN or toward recognition, so I'm not exactly sure, but if you make the wrong move on China, I will come out and I will publicly oppose you. So this issue has a lot of controversy in the United States over a very long period of time, and I agree with you that more recently it seems to have come down more to a congressional executive issue, but it is the China question, the Taiwan relationship, this has all been mixed up in American politics in very complicated ways for a very long time.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Doris Huang. I'm a freshman at the college. And it seems to me that while in recent years the communist regime in Beijing has allowed its economy to move from state control to more of a market economy system, that the government is still at best reluctant to admit openly that that's what it's doing, ostensibly to save face and avoid admitting that its past policies may have failed. So my question is, if reunification between Taiwan and China were to occur, what would its impact be on this phenomenon? Would the reacquisition of Taiwan encourage the Communist Party to openly acknowledge the fact that it wants to move towards democracy and capitalism, or do you think that the status quo would be maintained?
Or would the Kuomintang be elected overwhelmingly back to power?
Good question as well.
Right? Would you?
I think, you know, in terms of the Communist Party openly admitting to what it is doing in terms of creating a market economy, basically a capitalist economy, it's obviously, you know, as long as it's a Communist Party that is claims to have, you know, to have its origins in the Marxist-Leninist Mao Zedong thought and so on, it's extremely hard to come out and say bluntly, because it undermines the very logic of having a monopoly power in government. But the reality is, of course, that everyone knows what's happening, and that socialism is taking on gradually, to the extent it has any meaning, it'll eventually, I suppose, move toward the way socialism is thought in Western Europe or something where it's more of a social welfare phenomena than anything to do with state ownership of the means of production. So I think that that is happening, and long before we're going to be talking about any real substantial negotiations on reunification or anything of that sort, the Chinese will have abandoned any notion of socialism, and they've effectively virtually done it already. I mean, the central government is only trying to support about 1,000 or 2,000 state enterprises out of the tens of thousands that exist. Anyway, I'll stop at that.
Yeah, Sean?
I very much echo what Dwight just said, but I think the Communist Party has come closer in the recent month to recognizing that explicitly that it is moving to a market economy and even a political system that is not based on dictatorship of the proletariat. They have explicitly given up on that doctrine of dictatorship of proletariat. The three represents theory advocated, which is becoming a piece of laughingstock in the Western press. But to me, this is actually one of the most fundamental political changes in China that has happened in the last 20 years. For a communist regime to come out and say that we gave up on the notion of class struggle. It's, as Dwight said, this is not something very easy for the regime to do it, and yet they have done it. And obviously the party is now suffering a little bit because of the legitimacy problem. But yet we have to admire, give them credit for their ability to actually make this doctrinal transition. And there's, again, a lot of inconsistency between their view of what the socialist democratic system is and what a true democratic system is. Obviously, there's a lot of inconsistency there, but I think we ought to recognize that the Communist Party is coming around eventually to this incredibly convoluted idea that they can actually still be a genuine communist country when the economy and society are fundamentally different. And this leadership has come to that contradiction and tried to deal with it in a way that I think quite courageous.
Just very quickly, the point that I made a few seconds ago about identity and civic identity, I think that complicates the two political systems coming together, because what I meant to say was that ethnicity really doesn't make any difference. What counts is a civic loyalty to a particular kind of political system, and that's growing in Taiwan. And to mesh that with anything that's going to emerge in the foreseeable future in China, I think is very difficult. I would just say that Khrushchev gave up on class struggle 4 decades ago. and the Soviet Union stumbled on for a considerable amount of time after that.
He did
Thank
give up
you.
the class struggle, but he just didn't tell anybody.
No, we said the state of the whole people.
Oh. Yes, sir.
Hi, it's Kevin Chan from the Kennedy School. I had a question about, I think a lot of the talks sort of centering on the windows of opportunity for reunification are predicated on the idea of further economic integration. But there are there's a lot of researchers out there who are saying that, in fact, perhaps the Chinese economic miracle isn't as robust as we might think it is. And indeed, there's an article in the New Republic, I think, this week that addresses this issue. So I guess the question is, in terms of Chinese foreign policy, the way they're thinking about it, how does a faltering economy affect the timetable for unification?
How does a what economy?
Faltering. If the Chinese economy were to falter.
That's correct.
I personally think it will be a major problem. A poor, weak China under what circumstances would Taiwan want to be part of that kind of an entity? So that's one issue. A poor, weak China is also probably a less stable China. And for that matter, a weak Taiwan economy is a less stable Taiwan, none of which also plays into all kinds of political activities that would probably create tension rather than solutions. I don't happen to think that the Chinese economy, the mainland economy, is in great trouble. All economies have problems, and certainly the Chinese, we could spend the next 2 hours talking about the problems, but I think there's every reason to think they will continue to grow at a fairly rapid rate.
Yeah, Sean?
Also, I think the U.S. press often portrays China as having a very aggressive foreign policy. I actually think China has a very moderate foreign policy. It has been very cooperative with the United States on anti-terrorism war. It has been it signed on to the WTO agreement, which is fundamentally is going to bring about a lot of changes in the Chinese economy. And so there's one issue about whether the Chinese economy is growing fast or growing slow, but there's another issue, which is the Chinese economy, relative to the size of the economy and relative to the fact that it is a continental economy, is actually extremely dependent on foreign trade and foreign direct investment, right? So that moderates the behavior of the Chinese foreign policy makers to some extent. So I actually view Chinese foreign policy as quite accommodating, and there are few key principles that the Chinese policymakers are not going to give up in order to keep the economy going, Taiwan being one of them. So I think this is one issue that the U.S. and Taiwan ought to be extremely cautious about, because this is one issue, one foreign policy issue that Chinese government is not going to subordinate to their economic interests.
Thank you. Yes, please. Our penultimate question.
Okay, Tom Ritigliano, Kennedy School. My question is about the role of Taiwanese democracy in this whole process. The mainland's made very clear that any sort of Taiwanese referendum on independence is completely unacceptable. So my question is, how is Beijing going to respond to what seems like the new reality that any substantial move from the status quo in either direction is going to require some sort of democratic legitimization in Taiwan?
I think the Chinese position is also that if there is to be a referendum, it's one in which China should also take part.
Oh, just Beijing, that would be enough.
Comment on this? Steve, would you like to?
It is the policy, I believe, of the United States that any accommodation must be with, I think there are two versions, either with the consent of the people of Taiwan or according to the democratic processes of Taiwan. I think the former was President Clinton. I think the latter was Richard Bush. The referendum question is an interesting question because if American policy is what it says it is, then how else can the people of Taiwan express their willingness to become a part of the People's Republic of China, except by referendum or perhaps a vote of the legislative yuan, but it isn't clear. And so I think that when Chen Shui-bian and others talk about a referendum, first place, the Constitution does not provide for a referendum. The second point is that I think what they're talking about predominantly is a positive referendum. Do you want to reunify, not do you want independence? Now, the view on the mainland would be, I think the result would be the same. But there is a subtle difference there. It's a difficult question, a referendum, because as Bill says, as far as the Chinese are concerned, this is a problem of all the Chinese people.
Right, and there is nothing in the ROC Constitution
Right.
that would, under the present Constitution, actually
Correct.
prohibit it. Is our final question. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Richard Ludford. I'm a graduate of the Kennedy School. I'm wondering what the major world power centers have had to say about the resolution of the issues between these two sides, and I'm thinking Japan, Russia, the European Union, and the United Nations.
Well, almost every country in the world has in some way acknowledged, expressed respect for the PRC position on one China. That said, almost every country in the world also, or major country, has some kind of very substantial relationship, unofficial relationship with Taiwan. Nobody wants to see war. Japan is the country outside of the US that is probably the most engaged and potentially conflicted. That is to say, if there were a real threat of war, we have an alliance, and I don't have any doubt that the United States would expect Japan to fulfill the obligations which are spelled out in various ways under that alliance. But I think there would also be a very strong feeling in Japan that, depending on this, it's a scenario-driven situation. How did this start? Was it provoked by Taiwan? Was it provoked by the mainland? Was it unclear? Et cetera. So I think everybody would like to see it not explode into war. But I think most of them, the major European powers, for example, feel very distant, I think, from the central political issues. They're increasingly engaged economically, and they would like to promote some sort of stability. But I don't myself see this. As far as Russia's concerned, you know, there's this standard sort of exchange that China and Russia had, including this week with Putin in Beijing, that they support each other's principal positions. I mean, Russia says it won't have any official relationship of any kind with Taiwan, but I'm sure they have a fairly major relationship of various substantive sorts. Can I take the opportunity to make one other point about what this issue is really all about? And I wanted to do it perhaps in response to the economic question before. I don't think the issue that we're all talking about is really whether there's going to be reunification, be it forced or peaceful, in any near-term time frame. I think the issue, first of all, the really salient issue today is, can a political framework be created in which the mainland can be confident that Taiwan is not going to move to separatism, and in which Taiwan can be confident that the mainland is not going to use coercion, force of various sorts against it, so that as they work out a longer-term relationship, they have some confidence that their basic needs and principles are being met. I think that that kind of political framework is very difficult to come by for all the reasons that have been talked about here, but I don't think it's impossible. But I have to say, I don't think that other major powers, for the most part, are going to play a role in that. I guess I disagree a little bit with Dwight Perkins. I do think that the U.S., while we shouldn't get in the middle of it, whatever we do is going to play an important role in this, and we have to be careful about it. But the main responsibility rests in Taipei and Beijing, and not with anybody else.
I will take that, because we are at the end of our time, a very cautiously optimistic note on which to end our forum today. And I would like to thank John and Nina again. I'd like to thank Bill White, the director of the forum, and to thank you all. You have heard from our, we should call them our Suga Daibiao, our four people who have represented four given us different points of view and perspectives on an issue of, without question, enduring interest and a permanent state of creative non-resolution. Thank you all very much.